Connecting to the cloud server, we are on. We are ready to bring the Messiah. The Messiah this evening is going to get 1,000 years closer to us. That's a big achievement for 2 hours. Last week we learned about Shimon Bar Koziba, Bar Kochba, and we didn't do the very last part, which is the contemporary relevance of the thing. That's what we're going to look at now, maybe for up to about a half an hour. Bar Kochba caused a polemic, a major polemic, 2,000 years after he was killed. Not many people can do that. You know, there's people who cause fights, and there's people who have influence many generations after their lifetime. But to cause a major national polemic 2,000 years after you died, that is quite an achievement. And that is what Bar Kochba was able to do. I will do a share screen. Hold on. Here is the share screen. Okay. And what we will do is this. I'm back in the document from last week, everybody. Same document, but at the last part that we didn't already see. You saw these pictures of how thousands of years later, Bar Kochba has a militaristic influence on the holiday of Lag BaOmer, the Bar Kochba Sports Club in Berlin. And then finally, this is the issue that we're going to talk about, the children dancing in Haifa on Lag BaOmer. And Bar Kochba is this military hero, and he shows the Jews can have muscles, and the Jews can stand up for themselves, and the Jews can stand up for their independence. And he is a model and an inspiration to the modern movement of Zionism. Before class started tonight, Esther asked me, you know, is it so true what you said? She said, I described Jesus as a Messiah who was like more on the spiritual side, more that everything should be in your heart. Whereas Bar Kochba was the exact opposite, the way I described it. He was a military Messiah. He's leading an army. He's going to defeat the Roman Empire. And she asked, you know, is that really so true? Because you can find in the New Testament very militaristic verses. You know, the Jesus with gusto, he predicts the destruction of Jerusalem. A sword is going to come and destroy the evildoers, and there's going to be persecution, and there's going to be punishment. And the potential for violence in Christianity, it didn't just happen in the Middle Ages by itself. There were roots of it. There were sources of it already in the New Testament. All of that being the case, Jesus never led armies. Jesus never personally, okay? He never personally tried to kill anybody or have anybody kill anybody. Even though the roots are there. Esther is asking a question. Yes? Oh, okay. Esther is saying it's not that he could, not that he would not, it's that he could not. He didn't have the ability, or he didn't have the means to lead an army. Okay, that's giving Jesus a little bit less the benefit of the doubt. Regardless, I think we can all agree that in real life, okay, and what he actually did, he wasn't Bar Kochba. He still inspires children 2,000 years later, but he doesn't inspire children to dance around a bonfire on Lag BaOmer, singing about the powerful, what was that song we did last week? You know, he jumps on the lion and rides away with the lion, right? Jesus didn't inspire exactly that. And Bar Kochba did. And so in 1950, you have this realization of the spirit of Bar Kochba in the Zionist ethos. All of that changes in 1980. I summed it up here very briefly in a paragraph. Okay, we'll do the paragraph, but I want to expand the conversation to some degree. I don't know who has heard of Yehoshaphat Harkabi. He was in the 1950s the head of IDF military intelligence. And later in life, later in his career, he becomes a professor of international relations at the Hebrew University, also of Middle Eastern studies. He published, and before we get to what he published, you need to know also that in the 1950s, or the 60s, I guess, he was already warning about the danger of the PLO. He said, this is an organization that is going to constitute a threat to the state of Israel in coming years. He was one of the first intelligence officers to warn about the possible future strength of the PLO and the danger that it might represent. And yet, by 1980, he was of the opinion that the PLO and the international sympathy for the PLO was too much for a small state like the state of Israel to stand up to. And it would be better if the state of Israel, instead of fighting the PLO, would come to some sort of agreement with the PLO. And he pursued this in 1980, okay? In 1980, he published a scathing evaluation of the Bar Kokhba revolt, you see where I am in the paragraph, as an act of national suicide led by an irresponsible adventurer. Now you may ask, what does a professor at the Hebrew University, not a professor of ancient times, not of history, right? A professor of the modern Middle East and a professor of modern international relations. What does he have writing a book about the Bar Kokhba rebellion 2,000 years before? That would seem to be a bit distant, right, from his normal area of study. I'm just going to admit people. Excuse me. Hold on. I can't admit people. Wait. Maybe if I go like this. Here it is. Okay. Okay, done. All right, I'm back. I'm sorry. So what is he writing this book about in 1980 about the Bar Kokhba revolt? It's not really about Bar Kokhba revolts. Okay, he wasn't really writing about Bar Kokhba, even though most of the book is about Bar Kokhba. The real object of the book was an irresponsible adventurer who was the prime minister of the state of Israel by the name of Menachem Begin. And there's a link here to an interview in Hebrew. For those of you who read Hebrew, he had an interview with Menachem Begin in 1980. It's well known Menachem Begin, despite being the head of the Likud, was very magnanimous in his victory, and he wanted to take talented people from other parties and bring them into his government and bring them into his ministries and use their expertise for the good of the state of Israel. So he had a discussion or an interview with Harkabi, with Professor Harkabi, and you can see from the interview why Menachem didn't bring Harkabi into his government or into his ministries, and why Harkabi says it pretty much out in front in the interview, why he has no interest being in Menachem Begin's government. Why not? The reason is because Menachem Begin thought that Israel should continue to have some degree of control over the lands captured in the 1967 war, especially Judea and Samaria. And Harkabi thought that that was a foolishness on the level of Bar Kokhba. What was the foolishness of Bar Kokhba? The accusation was that Bar Kokhba led the kingdom, or the remnants of the kingdom of Judea, into an impossible revolt against the Roman Empire that was doomed doomed to failure, and he led his people to a disaster that reverberated for 2,000 years. In other words, the Jewish people didn't recover, according to Harkabi, from the disaster of Bar Kokhba for 2,000 years because this rebel decided to bite off more than he could chew, or the Jewish people decided to try to swallow more than they could digest. And it was an act of suicide comparable to Israel trying to hold on to Judea and Samaria. That was the true object of his ire in the book. So fierce debate about this book took place for 2 years until the beginning of Operation Peace for Galilee in 1982, about which Harkabi wrote an epilogue in his book's English translation. The title of the English translation is The Bar Kokhba Syndrome. It's not really Bar Kokhba, it's the Bar Kokhba Syndrome of Jews who don't know when to stop, Jews who don't know the limits of their power, Jews who don't know when it's time to compromise, Jews who don't know when it's time to make peace, or when it's time to come to some kind of an agreement, or Jews who don't know the limits of how much a small state can stand up to the international community. Okay. A surprising parallel to Harkabi's views be found in Vayoel Moshe. Vayoel Moshe was the great ideological work by Rabbi Moshe Titelbaum, the Satmar Rebbe, the great anti-Zionist ideologue. They don't come to the same conclusion, of course. Harkabi is a Zionist who wants the state of Israel to do what, in his opinion, is realistic for the future of the Jewish people, so that there will be a Jewish state. He thinks that finding some sort of modus vivendi with the PLO will help the Jewish state survive, or to not take drastic action in Lebanon will help the Jewish state survive. Rabbi Yoel Titelbaum thinks that the Jewish state is going to be utterly destroyed because it's an act of Satan. So they're not the same ideologically, but Rabbi Yoel Titelbaum was one of the first Orthodox ideologues of Bar Kokhba, who tried to say that just like his claim was that Bar Kokhba was a rebel against God. Okay, there's actually sources for that in rabbinic literature that we didn't see last week. There's one piece in rabbinic literature where Bar Kokhba quotes the book of Job, and he says, "Don't go with us to war, God. We'll fight on our own, because 60 years before, in the year 70, we saw how much you helped us. We don't want your help. We'll do it on our own." That's a midrash. The midrash casts him that way. And so Rabbi Yoel Titelbaum says that this Bar Kokhba is a rebel against God, and he tried to bring the redemption when it wasn't really time for the redemption. Okay? There's a phrase for that, okay, to bring the kates, the end times, closer than they really are meant to be, to bring the redemption before its time. And Harkabi has a similar, echoes that, even though he's a Zionist, he echoes that these Jews like Bar Kokhba and like Menachem Begin, right, that they want the redemption, they want things to be fully, perfect the way they should be, and they don't realize that realistically the Jews are trying to bite off more than they can chew. One of the stunning replies to Harkabi's book and to his political stance overall was by the first IDF chief of staff and also famous archaeologist, a fantastic archaeologist and historian, Yigael Yadin. And he is the person who we saw last week personally discovered the Bar Kokhba letters in Ein Gedi in 1960 and 61. If you remember last week, the last general of Judea, 2,000 years ago, wrote letters to his troops. And these letters were found in a cave by the first general of the risen state of Israel. Right? It's almost like he's writing letters to the to the Israeli general 2,000 years later. And when Yigael Yadin, who knew Harkabi and worked with Harkabi, when he read Harkabi's book, he was both floored and he was vehement. Okay, he couldn't accept the book, and he couldn't accept the political stance represented by Yehoshaphat Harkabi. And don't forget, for those who read Hebrew, it's very, very passionate, his response to Harkabi. And for those who read Hebrew, you can read it. For those who don't read Hebrew, I'll just tell you the most significant and passionate point that he made. He made general points about Bar Kokhba himself. He said that, when you create an army of what looks like to be 500,000 Jews, and it is well armed, and it is motivated, and it succeeds in freeing Judea for years. I said a couple of years we saw last week from Roman rule. Okay, and it took the Romans 11 legions drawn even from Britain to put down this rebellion. You may not realize that what you're doing is hopeless. Okay, not every rebellion that breaks out in the world knows that it's going to win. So do you blame the rebel for trying? Okay, that was the first response of Yigael Yadin. The second response was to compare it to the War of Independence. And he writes with great emotion how Ben-Gurion in 1948 summoned Yigael Yadin, who was the first chief of staff of the Israeli Defense Forces. Right? He was the leader, the military leader of the War of Independence. So Ben-Gurion summoned him together to meet with a group of 15 leaders of what was the temporary leadership before the first elections in the state of Israel. He invites Yadin to meet with this leadership and to present his opinion about whether it is possible to win in a war of independence if the state of Israel declares its independence. So Yadin, apparently with a couple other military leaders, they met with these 15 men in Tel Aviv. And he says that what I told Ben-Gurion is this. He said, if you're talking about men, we're vastly outnumbered. If you're talking about ammunition, we're vastly outnumbered. It may be that pretty soon we'll get a little bit of a plus in the ammunition because there's a delivery coming by ship, he said. And then he writes in parentheses what was on that ship: 12 cannons, 6 of which were missing spare parts. Okay? All right, so we may get a bit more, a bit more ammunition, right? But he said, numbers and ammunition are not the only thing that counts in war. And he said that our men are tremendously motivated. They're motivated for their own lives, they're motivated for the lives of their families, and they're motivated because after the Holocaust, they want to see a state of Israel arise. And none of our enemies, he said, have that kind of motivation. So his conclusion to Ben-Gurion was that with all of that motivation, if a war breaks out, the chance for Jewish survival was about 50-50. That's what he told Ben-Gurion, and based on that recommendation, Ben-Gurion decided to declare the independence for the state of Israel. He says, by the way, that Ben-Gurion, when he invited him, he said, "You are not to speak when I invite you," he said, "about whether we should declare independence. That's not what I'm asking you. That's for us, the 15 people, to decide, not you. From you, all I want to hear is, what are our chances?" Okay, and the chances were 50-50. And so Yigael Yadin responded to Yehoshaphat Harkabi that, he said, given what you write about Bar Kokhba, right, it was an act of national suicide to declare independence in 1948. And the same thing was probably true by trying to survive in 1967 instead of having 2 million Jews just run away. And you really see even the political divide between old labor Zionism before around 1980 versus new labor Zionism after around the year 1980, where Yadin represents the old and Harkabi represents the new. Yeah, Jenny. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Jenny is asking, she says, in 1948, weren't the odds better than 2,000 years ago? Because 2,000 years ago, it was the Roman Empire. I'm going to talk off the top of my head, Gael Yadin, but from the spirit of his remarks, he didn't just talk about motivation. He also talked about actual possibilities. And in the spirit of his remarks, I'll venture to say, okay, that the odds in 48 were probably worse, meaning there were more Jews in the land of Israel 2,000 years ago than there were in 1948. Okay, here you have modern, well-equipped armies, with nothing the Romans could have even dreamed of. And my impression is, at least, that Yadin doesn't compare it that way. Okay, other opponents of Harkabi, Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook and Israel Eldad. Tzvi Yehuda Kook is we'll call it the religious side or the Orthodox side, and Israel Eldad is the secular Zionist side. I think he himself was personally observant, but what he represented was a secular movement. He was a leader of the Lehi. And Tzvi Yehuda Kook simply said that without Bar Kokhba, the Jewish people could not have arisen to build the state of Israel. It was that spirit, it was that example. Bar Kokhba showed that we almost did it. Okay, we were almost there. It is, in that case, possible. And he claims, I'm not saying it's my claim, it's his claim. Tzvi Yehuda Kook's claim was, without that example, Jews for the next 2,000 years, none of them would have ever thought it was possible without the example of the Bar Kokhba revolt. And in terms of Eldad, I won't explain it to you because you can read it yourself. This time it's in English. He has a book called The Jewish Revolution with a link here to it, an English translation. And a summary of the whole Israeli debate in English can be found both in a New York Times article and in a sermon by Rabbi Benny Lau, also in English, in the Jerusalem Post, where he compared the Bar Kokhba revolt and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and Passover, okay? All of and I think he also, of course, talks about the state of Israel. Okay, so Bar Kokhba and the military Bar Kokhba, it resonates to this very day. To this very day, if you take educated Israelis, maybe not the Israeli on the street, but if you take educated Israelis, and you ask about Bar Kokhba, you are almost sure to get one of two reactions. The first reaction is the Harkabi reaction. It was a disaster that it took us 2,000 years to overcome, and we better not repeat that mistake. And the other reaction is that it was an incredible revolt, and it was a model, and maybe it could have succeeded. Okay, before Harkabi, that was almost the only opinion, right? And since Huckabee, it's become one of two opinions. And you can usually tell where Israelis stand ideologically without even asking who they voted for, just by asking them about Bar Kokhba. Okay, so we'll conclude Bar Kokhba here with one final remark in order to bridge a gap of 1,000 years, okay? Up till now, we've been talking about ancient messiahs, okay? Messiahs from ancient times, from classical times, in our case, from Roman times. All of these messiahs, whether it was Jesus of Nazareth, whether it was all the David-like figures, if you remember, that Josephus wrote about, was seemed to be like proto-Bar Kokhbas. They were all on the militaristic side, right? Guerrilla fighters, that sort of thing. And of course, Bar Kokhba himself. These are all in the ancient world. You can see that the more widespread model in the ancient world was the military model, okay? The Jesus model was kind of unique, and it ultimately conquered a large part of the world by the sword, like I think Esther was trying to hint at the beginning of class, but it certainly wasn't by the sword in the initial centuries of Christianity. We also saw sources, okay, that talk about a Messiah who has God's help, and a Messiah who can do miracles, and a Messiah who's going to bring great changes to the world, versus a Bar Kokhba who didn't bring any big changes to the world, who, according to the Midrash that I spoke about tonight, maybe even didn't want to be too involved with God. Well, you have these two models in the ancient world, and they're going to come back later in history in different ways. We're going to skip 1,000 years to the next, what I'll designate it this way, the next influential Messiah, okay? 1,000 years from Bar Kokhba to Maimonides. Maimonides wasn't the Messiah, but it was in his time, okay? 1,000 years from Bar Kokhba to Maimonides, there were here and there, okay, Jews with messianic pretensions, okay? It did exist. However, we hardly even know their names, if we know their names at all. Most of the time we don't even know their names. And they didn't leave any lasting heritage, okay? Bar Kokhba left a heritage. Jesus certainly left a heritage to the world, and in the sense of polemic, he left a heritage even to the Jewish people, okay? But whichever messiahs came up in the 1,000 years between Bar Kokhba and Maimonides, they did not leave any heritage for the Jews, okay? The Messiah in Yemen during the generation of Maimonides did leave a heritage. It wasn't the heritage that he wanted to leave, okay? But he provoked something which led to a creation, okay? A creation of a major epistle by Maimonides that was one of the most important sources about Jewish messianism to this very day. Now we're about 800 years or more past since the passing of Maimonides. So the Messiah in Yemen, even though we don't know his name, we're going to see what he provoked, okay? It's important to see what he provoked and what he led to be written, also because all of the coming Messiahs that we're going to do in coming weeks, okay, not until the end of the course, okay, but the ones that we're going to do in coming weeks, they are all Kabbalistic messiahs, okay? They're all messiahs that rise out of Kabbalistic ideas, which means that we're going to have to talk about Kabbalah, about Jewish mysticism, I was even going to propose to Don, we'll talk about it specifically later, that we'll switch not the dates of the course, but maybe the inner organization of a part of the course, so that we'll do Messianism and Kabbalah before we get to the messiahs that arose out of those messianic ideas. It will make it easier to understand. I was thinking about it on the way here. Okay, but the Messiah, this is really important, the Messiah that arose in the generation of Maimonides was not a Kabbalistic Messiah. He couldn't have been, impossible, he couldn't have been a Kabbalistic Messiah. Why? Because the Kabbalah hadn't yet crystallized, okay? Even if you accept that it's an ancient tradition, well, then it was just private. Okay, it was a private, hidden, secret tradition. But the crystallization of Kabbalah that happened in Provence in Spain, that eventually resulted in the book that we call the Zohar, that was all in response to Maimonides. The person who claims this to the greatest effect was Professor Moshe Idel. Okay, that the flowering of Kabbalah in the Middle Ages was a response to the rationalistic challenge, okay, that Maimonides represented. But just think about it for now, even if you didn't get that, just think about it in terms of time. If Maimonides provoked the flowering of the Kabbalah, then any Messiah, right, up till the time of Maimonides, including the time of Maimonides, would not have been a Kabbalistic Messiah, even just chronologically. So there were some Messiahs here and there for 1,000 years from Bar Kokhba to the Rambam, but they didn't leave a lasting effect. We don't even know really for the most part how big they were, how really influential they were in their times. I think I might have told the joke in the past about how when I was a student at Yeshiva University and the Messiah who used to stand outside the door, nobody's nodding their head here. In the administration building at Yeshiva University, there was a fellow who would stand outside the entrance day in and day out, winter and summer, never failed. And what would this guy do? Every student who went into the building, he would try to give him, at least if the student took it, he'd try to give him a piece of paper. What was on the piece of paper? The piece of paper was mostly numbers. It was a list or I don't know, kind of stuff about scores for the New York Mets. Okay, what does that have to do with the Messiah? On this piece of paper, he proves through gematria, through numerical manipulations of the scores of the New York Mets, that he's the Messiah. Okay, we call him the Messiah of First Hall. Okay, F-U-R-S-T, that's the administration building at Yeshiva University. Okay, so years ago I took this course, well, not this course, but I took a course in Jewish Messianism with Professor David Berger at Yeshiva University. And at some point in the course, he mentioned this. He says, you know, just because you find in some historical source that some guy claimed he was the Messiah, it doesn't mean, you know, that this was some big movement that rocked the world. Right? It could be like that guy who stands outside of First Hall. He said, just imagine if 1,000 years from now, archaeologists dig up First Hall, right? And they find one of these papers and they say, oh, 1,000 years ago, there was a Messianic movement at Yeshiva University based on the New York Mets, right? It doesn't always work that way. I mean, just because you see that somebody mentions a Messiah, it doesn't mean that that supposed Messiah is necessarily causing a lot of trouble. You don't really know hundreds or thousands of years later how much this really reverberated. When it comes to the Messiah in the time of Maimonides, we know that it did reverberate. We know that this guy, even if we don't have his name, that he was important. He was so important that the leaders of Yemenite Jewry, okay, wrote a letter begging help from Egypt, right, from Maimonides. And they asked for guidance because they were in big trouble and they didn't know what to do, okay? And you don't have leaders who are Torah scholars writing letters for help like that if what's going on at home isn't really that significant. Okay, this was significant, and we can learn little tidbits about this Messiah and what kind of person he was and how the people around him reacted to him from the kind of answer that Maimonides gives in this epistle. So without further ado, I will share with you the epistle to Yemen. There is a link to it in the WhatsApp. And now I can't find the WhatsApp anymore. The WhatsApp is in the, I know the WhatsApp is in the, is that it? Okay. 1 second. Messianic movements. And here is the link to Google Docs. Okay. No. I opened the work again. Down, down, down. Further down. Yep. Further down. And here it is. Here's the link to epistle to Yemen. I am very, very grateful because without the library, I didn't have any access to any English translation of the Epistle of Yemen. So I thought, how am I going to teach it? Okay, I have it at home in Hebrew in a couple of different versions, but I didn't have it in English. I even have it, by the way, in here, I have it in Arabic. Okay, if anybody wants to read it in Arabic, but I didn't have it in English. But I did a search, and I am very grateful to volunteers at English Wikisource. You know, you all know Wikipedia, where you can find articles about things. So this is Wikisource, and I'm trying to enlarge the text, but I'm not able to. Control plus done on your computer. Okay. I don't, is this big enough for people to see? It's not big enough for people to see?
Pretty tiny, but if I get in close, it's okay.
I'm trying to do control plus, but it's not working. Oh, here, now it's working. Is that better? Okay, much better. Here we are. Okay, I'll move all your pictures over so I can see the text better. And yes, this is translated by Boaz Cohen, who was an important scholar and also a leader of the conservative movement. If I'm not mistaken, he also translated a conservative Siddur and a conservative Machzor, not just the Epistle to Yemen. And it has notes by Abraham Halkin. It has an historical introduction, just a few paragraphs. The main point for our purposes is that it was in around 1172. In the book that I was using by Shilat, it's 1175. But around that time, 1172 or 1175, is when this messianic claimant began his campaign in Yemen. Okay, he talks about the contents of this epistle. It's called the Epistle to Yemen, Igeret Timan in Hebrew. It's one of Maimonides' most famous letters. And there's a lot of religious polemics in this. The reason for the religious polemics, which we're going to read much less of, if at all, is because of the entire reason that the letter was written. It wasn't just written because of a Messiah. I'm talking about the letter from Yemen to Egypt, the letter from Yemen to Maimonides. It was written because there was what's in Hebrew called a Shema. It was a time of persecution of the Jews, where there was forced conversion to Islam. Okay, the rebel who took over the leadership of Yemen, okay, the Muslim, wanted to forcibly convert all of the Jews in Yemen, and that is eerily similar to what Maimonides and his family themselves went through when they lived in Spain, and then when they fled to Morocco and traveled through North Africa. At the time in North Africa, I'm talking about Maimonides' time, when Maimonides was young, when he was a teenager and when he was in his 20s. Why did Maimonides' family flee from Spain and eventually wind up in Egypt? Because of El Muwahidun, okay, because of this group of extreme Muslims, okay, who were Berbers. They were not Arabs. They were ancient natives of North Africa. That may have been part of the reason for this friction with the Muslim establishment. And these Berbers revolted, and they also forced Jews to convert publicly in the mosque to make the declaration, right, that that there's one God and Muhammad is his prophet. And there are historians who think, not all agree, but there are historians who think that it's quite likely that Maimonides and his family themselves did this. Okay? They were in the situation. Maimonides has another epistle besides this one, where he writes that it's always better to take the Islamic oath and to continue to worship God loyally and secret. And as soon as you can, as soon as you have the ability to get up and take your family and leave the country that is governed by these laws and find another place to live where you can live openly as Jews. He did not see Islam as idolatry, therefore there was no reason to try to become a martyr. He argues against that strenuously in his other epistle. And in this epistle, when the Jews are here, he feels like deja vu, and he writes that. He writes that what's happening to you is exactly what happened to us, right? We were living among the Muslims as Jews, and then this new government came, these rebels came and tried to force everyone to convert. And that's exactly what happened to you in Yemen now. That's the reason there's so much religious polemics in this epistle. It's not only about messiahs. The religious polemics is to make the Jews in Yemen very sure about what they stand for. And Maimonides spells out in the clearest terms possible what is the Jewish tradition, what do we stand for, and why is it worth standing for it. And it's very, very passionate and very, very clear. So that also makes it one of the best introductions, by the way, to Jewish thought. This epistle. It's a wonderful introduction to a general Jewish outlook, at least as Maimonides, excuse me, at least as Maimonides understands it. And he compares the Jews, what the Jews believe, to the Muslims, and also if you read it yourselves, you'll see towards the Christians. Okay, and he also gives examples of how to retort to Muslim accusations. There's also astrology here, okay? And, maybe in the Bible, certainly in rabbinic literature, there's a lot of astrology. Maimonides thought that astrology was bunk. And apparently, those Jews in Yemen who thought that the Messiah was coming to save them from this oppression, they would look for astrological signs. Okay, they would try to prove via astrology that that this is indeed the redemption and this person is indeed the Messiah. So if Maimonides can debunk astrology, he's also debunking a messianic movement in Yemen. And finally, messianism, which we won't read here in the introduction, we'll read it in the actual text. Okay, for those of you who want to follow in the text itself rather than via my screen, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do now. I'm doing a search for the number 14 because we're going to start where the text has note 14, except there's a lot of verse 14. There it is. It's one up. Okay, this is where we're going to start in the text. It is page, for those who want to skip down, it's page XV15. Okay. The text is subdivided into page numbers. Okay, so it's XV 15. XV is 15. Are you on the same link as I have? Yeah. So skip down to XV. Okay? Or you can just look at the share screen, whichever works best for you. Okay? All right. Could one of the people on Zoom perhaps volunteer to read? I'd be very appreciative. Okay, Elisheva, go for it. Oh, we don't hear you. You unmute yourself, Elisheva.
Sorry. It is, my co-religionists, one of the fundamental articles of the faith of Israel that the future Redeemer of our people will spring only from the stock of Solomon, son of David. He will gather our nation, assemble our exiles, redeem us from our degradation, propagate the true religion, and exterminate his opponents, as is clearly stated in Scripture. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not nigh. There shall step forth a star out of Jacob, and the scepter shall arise out of Israel, and shall smite through the corners of Moab, and break down all the sons of Seth. And Edom shall be a possession. Seir also, even his enemies, shall be a possession, while Israel doeth valiantly.
Okay, this is from the prophecy of Bilam in the book of Numbers. We saw a fourth coming out of, a star coming out of Jacob with Bar Kokhba. Maimonides is citing that here too. The Messiah is someone who is going to conquer the nations. All the sons of Seth, Seth, that's my name by the way, is the third son of Adam, right, from whom and Noah is a descendant. So all of humanity are the children of Seth, like they're also the sons of Noah. In other words, the Messiah is going to conquer all of humanity. He's already beginning to hint here subtly to the people in Yemen. This Messiah of yours, does it look like he's going to conquer the world? Okay, go on.
He will be sent by God at a time of great catastrophe and dire misfortune for, try not to keep moving it around, I lost you, and dire misfortune for Israel, as was predicted in the verse. There will be none remaining, shut up or left at large. And when he appears, he will fulfill the promises made in his behalf. A later prophet, too, was alluding to the messianic tribulations when he declared, "But who can endure the day of his coming?" This is the proper understanding of this article of faith.
Okay, notice proper versus implied improper. Okay, there will be great misfortune. There will be great tribulations before the Messiah comes. But don't necessarily think that your tribulations in Yemen are those tribulations, or even if they are, that this is necessarily the Messiah who is supposed to arise right after them. Okay, I'm gonna move it a little bit, Elisheva, and now it's at the top. Okay.
From the prophecies of Daniel and Isaiah and the statement of our sages, it is clear that the advent of the Messiah will take place sometime subsequent to the universal expansion of the Roman Empire and Arabic rule, which is an actuality today. This fact is true beyond question or doubt. Daniel, in the latter part of his vision, alludes to the kingdom of the Arabs, to the rise of Muhammad, and then to the arrival of the Messiah. Similarly, excuse me, Isaiah intimated that the coming of the Messiah will occur after the rise of the madman. In the verse, a man riding on an ass, a man riding on a camel, and two men riding on horses. Now, the man riding on an ass is a symbolic reference to the Messiah, as is evident from another verse, which describes him as lowly and riding on an ass, Zechariah. He will follow the man riding on the camel, that is the Arabic kingdom. The statement, two men riding on horses, I have to wait for the chat to clear. Go away, thank you. He will follow the man riding, oh, I said that. The statement, two men riding on horses, refers to both empires, the Roman and the Arabian. A similar interpretation of Daniel's vision concerning the image and the beasts is correct beyond doubt. They are conclusions derived from the plain meaning of the text.
Okay, let's unpack this paragraph. First of all, does anyone know who the madman is?
Ainli Musag.
It sounds like it's Muhammad.
Yeah, that's
is?
Maimonides' term for Muhammad. He calls him the madman. In the Hebrew translations, you all know the word, I bet, Mishuga. Okay, HaMishuga, the madman, the insane one. That's how he here and in some other places he refers to Muhammad. We're about to get in a couple paragraphs from now. We'll see what his attitude towards madmen is. Okay, in other words, how are you supposed to treat a madman? But that is his attitude towards Muhammad. What is he doing in this paragraph? He's telling you that the general outline of the coming of the Messiah can indeed be known through the Bible, especially through the book of Daniel, which speaks about 4 kingdoms. And in Maimonides' interpretation, and it probably seemed pretty evident to almost anybody in the Middle Ages, that the last 2 of the 4 kingdoms are Rome and Arabia. Okay, these are the last 2 empires that will conquer the world before the arrival of the Messiah. He seems pretty sure of himself, and he's going to keep on talking like that. You'll see. Okay. Well, look, in other places, he says that it's very wrong to reveal these things, and you shouldn't talk about them too much. At the end of Mishneh Torah, he says, nobody really knows how these things are going to happen until they happen, because the verses are unclear, and the Midrashim are even more unclear. So why is he so adamant here about what's going to happen? Why do you think?
Because there's textual basis for it?
Okay, Elisheva says the text is going to be a basis for something. Don says it gives him authority. It may simply be that he's trying to give them hope. He's going, in a few paragraphs, he's going to utterly demolish their Messiah. The Messiah ain't here. But he wants to give hope at the same time. He wants to say you're not suffering for no reason. And the Jews of North Africa also didn't suffer for no reason. The Messiah is indeed imminent. He's not so far away. Just keep to your principles and stay that way until he comes. And don't let some false Messiah ruin all of your hopes, because he is coming and he's not too far off. That the Arabian kingdom that we live in is a prelude to his coming. Okay, Elisheva, in just a second. Okay, go ahead.
The precise date of the Messianic advent cannot be known, but I am in possession of an extraordinary tradition, which I received from my father, who in turn received it from his father, going back to our early ancestors who were exiled from Jerusalem and who were mentioned by the prophet in the verse, and the exiles of Jerusalem that are in Spain, Obadiah. According to this tradition, there is a covert indication in the prediction of Bilam to the future restoration of prophecy in Israel. Incidentally, it may be stated that there are other verses in the Torah which contain cryptic allusions in addition to their simple meaning.
Before you go on and we see these numbers, just realize what he's doing here. He says he has a family tradition that the family considers ancient, that it goes back already to before the exile. And this tradition is about when the re-advent of prophecy will occur. Notice what he's not doing. He has no family tradition about when the Messiah will arrive. But he does have a family tradition, he says here, for when prophecy will return. The return of prophecy is apparently supposed to be is apparently supposed to be a prelude to the coming of Messiah, or as we'll see in coming paragraphs, the Messiah himself is supposed to be a great prophet. So you need prophecy to return in order to have a messianic redemption. He is not telling them when the Messiah is going to come according to this tradition, but he is telling them about return of prophecy, which is connected to it. So he gives some examples. Start again from the example, for example, the word redo.
For example, the word redo in the remark of Jacob to his sons, redu Shema, get you down thither, has a numerical value of 210 and contains a hint to the length of Israel's stay in Egypt. Likewise, the statement of Moses, our teacher, when thou shalt beget children, and the children's children, and ye shall have been long in the land, embodies a reference to the duration of Israel's stay in Palestine, from the date of their arrival to the exile in the time of Jehoiakim, which was 840 years, corresponding to the numerical value of the word
Venoshantem ba'aretz.
10. Similarly, many other verses could be cited.
By the way, all the people here, many of you have like studied Maimonides with me over the years. Does this sound like Maimonides? It totally doesn't. The rest of the letter does. If you would read the letter from the beginning, you'd have no doubt that it was Maimonides. It really sounds like him. He's talking about numerology, and it sounds so not like Maimonides. Okay, to come back to Bilam's prophecy.
To come back to Bilam's prophecy, the verse, after the lapse of time, one will tell Jacob and Israel what God hath wrought, contains a veiled allusion to the date of the restoration of prophecy to Israel. The statement means that after the lapse of an interval equal to the time that passed from the 6 days of creation to Bilam's day, seers will again tell Israel what God hath wrought. Now Bilam uttered his prediction in the 38th year after the Exodus, which corresponds to the year 2485 after the creation of the world. For the Exodus took place in the beginning of the year 2448. According to the interpretation of this chronology, prophecy would be restored to Israel in the year 4970, after the creation of the world.
Okay, 4970 after the creation of the world. What year are we in?
Yeah, I was going to say we seem to have missed
57,
it.
57. So what year was 4970? Somebody do the quick calculation.
About 80 years ago.
80 years ago.
Sorry, 800.
No.
Sorry, I'm off a factor of 10.
1090?
It comes out to the year 1210.
Yeah.
1210 in the civil calendar. Maimonides was born in 1135. He's writing this letter at around 1175, and he died eventually in the year 1204. Okay, and he wasn't a young man. Okay, so the date that he's giving is a date which is not, it's not like, ages away in the future. It's, the decades to come. But on the other hand, it's not a date that he or the recipient of the letter is likely to live to see. Okay?
But not too far off.
It's not too far off. You're right. It's not. It's close enough to give you hope, right? It's close enough that's like it's almost within your grasp, or at least your children's grasp.
It's almost too close to be believable.
Really?
I mean, he could conceivably have lived that long.
He could have. Yeah,
I mean,
he could have.
It's only 6 years later.
It's only 6 years later.
No,
According
no,
to 70 is
It's
1210.
it's about 35 years later.
33.
You said 1210 and he died in
Right.
1204.
Oh, 6 years after he died, yes. But it's 35 years roughly after he's writing this letter.
Maybe, but it's only 6 years after he died. Conceivably, it's close enough that he could imagine that he and certainly his children would see it.
Yeah, it's easy enough to imagine for your children, and maybe, if you're blessed, right, then maybe for yourself. Well, it
Yes,
also,
it is 100 years later.
okay, it has the advantage, however, of being far enough away that it's too far away for the current Messiah in Yemen.
Yeah.
Okay, it's not likely to help his cause. And it's also not predicting the coming of the Messiah, to be quite clear. It's predicting the advent of prophecy. And what that has to do with the Messiah we're about to see. Okay? Bevakasha.
It is doubtless true that the reappearance of prophecy in Israel is one of the signs betokening the approach of the Messianic era, as is intimated in the scripture. And your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and I will show wonders in the heavens and in the earth before the great and terrible day of the Lord come. This is the most genuine tradition concerning the Messianic advent. We were admonished against and strictly prohibited from blazoning it abroad, lest some folk deem it unduly postponed. We have already apprised you concerning it, but God knows best what is true.
In other words, traditions like this, and even saying that the advent of prophecy needs to come first, these are things which should not be spread too much. These are things which should not be talked about too much. One of the reasons is because if an earlier generation, say, 1,000 years before Maimonides, people had spread around the tradition like this, then the Jews would have given up. What, the Messiah is not going to come for 1,000 years? It's too much, right? We can't bear that, and all of our efforts. What they're gonna help us make it for 1,000 years? This is too much for a person to digest. Okay, and yet he's doing it here, partially because now it's not too far off. And, a lot of people have discussed, so many people have discussed why Maimonides put this in his letter. Because numerology is so inappropriate to Maimonides, and because Maimonides says all over the place that you're not supposed to talk about or write about when the redemption is going to happen. And here he does it. So how come he does it here, right? And there's different approaches to this. It seems from the context that it's being done to give succor and comfort to the Jews of Yemen. In terms of the family tradition, personally, I find it hard to believe that Maimonides would just make something like that up. Okay, and I don't think he would claim a family tradition if he didn't really have a family tradition. The question is, if he had a family tradition, right, would he publicize it in a case of dire need? And apparently he did so here, if the way I'm thinking about this is correct.
Yeah.
On the other hand,
Okay.
Yeah. I noticed it says also your sons and your daughters will prophesy. Was that an aberration from the usual thinking of that time?
Well, this is the Bible. In the Bible, you have Nevi'ot.
Yeah.
You do.
Yes, you do.
Okay, so it's the biblical model. The Seder.
So I
Okay.
have a question. He
Yeah.
says you don't want to publicize this generally,
Yeah.
but let's face it, who is reading this letter that he writes? I don't imagine he has a terribly wide audience. They're probably very specific, learned people.
I disagree with you. I think he's writing this letter to the leaders of Yemen, not just for them to read, but for them to copy and distribute and have as many people in Yemen read it as possible.
How many people were literate?
a lot. It's about Yemenite Jews especially, for sure. We've talked about this in the past, that Jewish males, a lot of them were literate. Maybe not all of them for sure, but a lot of them were illiterate. And the Jews of Yemen had a reputation for this, for being literate and for being not scholarly in the, not scholarly in the pupil sense, but scholarly in the, reading from an early age and knowing things by heart.
So then he really was breaking his own rules.
Apparently for need. Apparently because the Jews of Yemen needed to be set straight about what they stood for, both for false messiahs and because of the persecution of the rulers. Okay, let's go on.
Your statement that Jeremiah alludes to the advent of the Messiah in the verse, "It is a time of trouble unto Jacob," is incorrect, for it needs must refer to the war of Gog and Magog, which will take place sometime after the arrival of the Messiah. Neither the fall of the Giron gate nor similar omens portend the coming of the Messiah.
In other words, these were things that were claimed in Yemen. Oh, this happened, the Messiah is here, and it proves that this guy is the Messiah. So he's refuting this. Okay.
Some of the supposed prophetic signs are mistakenly ascribed to the sages, while others owe their origin to figures of speech and enigmatic sayings of the rabbis, which should not be taken literally.
That is classic Maimonides.
Yeah.
And now we get to the fellow himself, not Maimonides, to the fellow in Yemen.
You mentioned that a certain man in one of the cities of Yemen pretends that he is the Messiah. Let's call it like it is in the first sentence. As I live, I am not surprised at him or at his followers, for I have no doubt that he is mad, and a sick person should not be rebuked or reproved for an illness brought on by no fault of his own. This is hysterical. Neither am I surprised at his votaries, for they were persuaded by him because of their sorry plight, their ignorance of the importance and high rank of the Messiah, and their mistaken comparison of the Messiah with the son of the Mahdi, the belief in whose rise they are witnessing.
Okay, in other words, you have an Islamic influence here. The Mahdi, the hidden redeemer, is one of the causes of the great schism in Islam between Sunni and Shiites. If you look in the Quran, you don't find too much about the end of days or about messiahs and stuff like that. But in the Islamic tradition afterwards, it does become prevalent, and it even becomes very highly influential. What he's saying here is that the average Jews in Yemen, they don't know what they're looking for. Okay, when we did the book of Midot, we had that metaphor that there's a place that everybody wants to get, but to reach, but not everybody gets there. Why does not everybody get there? There's one of two reasons. Okay, there's excuse me. That we're looking for somebody. Everybody's looking for somebody, but they're not sure. But they don't find him. Why don't they find him? There's two reasons. Reason number one could be that you don't know where to look for the person. So you look here, you look there, and you never go to the place where you're supposed to find him. But reason number two that people don't find this person could be that they don't even know what he looks like. So even if they go to the right place, they won't find the guy they're looking for because they won't recognize him. They don't know what he looks like. That's kind of what Maimonides is saying here. Okay, if the real Messiah appeared before these ignorant Jews in Yemen, people he's calling ignorant, they would miss him. They wouldn't even know that he was the Messiah because they don't know who to look for. They don't know what to look for when they're looking for a Messiah. In other words, they were persuaded by him because of their sorry plight Their ignorance of the importance and high rank of the Messiah, plus their comparison of the Messiah to an Islamic idea. The Messiah, says Maimonides, is somebody quite extraordinary. We're about to see in what ways this person is extraordinary. And if someone is not extraordinary in those ways, then there is no reason to give it any credence. Okay. Go on, but I am astonished.
But I am astonished that you, a scholar who has studied carefully the doctrines of the rabbis, are inclined to repose faith in him.
In other words, the writer of the letter wasn't sure.
Do you not know, my brother, that the Messiah is a very eminent prophet, more illustrious than all the prophets after Moses?
Okay, this again is straight classic Maimonides, despite all the numerology we had earlier, right? Moses is always the greatest of the prophets. Nothing will ever change that. There will never be a prophet as great as Moses, not Muhammad the madman, and certainly not even the Messiah himself. The Messiah himself will be a great prophet. So anyone who is not a great prophet, you can't give credence to. But even the Messiah will not be a prophet as great as Moses. This is very crucial. This is crucial for all of the Kabbalistic messiahs that we're going to start seeing in the coming weeks. Very crucial. Why? Why is Maimonides so adamant that Moses is the greatest prophet and even the Messiah will not be greater? Why is that so critical for him? What do you think?
Is it?
So Don says it's one of the 13 principles, but Don, Maimonides wrote the 13 principles. Why did he include it in the 13 principles?
Is it really mean to say the fact that his name was Moshe had something to do with it?
Oh, because his personal name is Moshe. He may have made the connection, but there's serious historical reasons for this. Because God spoke directly to Moses, is what's being said here. Yeah, but why can't God talk directly to the Messiah?
It could, but doesn't.
Well, why not? Why is it so important to say that God only talks directly to Moses and to nobody else, not even the Messiah?
Because
this is something that goes to the very guts of Messianism, and possibly even to the very guts of the Torah itself.
So that
God did not talk directly to any of the other prophets since Moshe.
That's what Don just said. What Hannah said is what Don said. You're both saying that, the Torah says, Lo kam b'Yisrael navi od kim Moshe.
Yep.
Well,
That means,
with all due respect, if you wanted to allow for a Messiah who was greater than Moses, you still could, because that's only
but
past tense.
then he might change the Torah.
Toda Rabba, who just said the picture?
Caroline.
Caroline. Toda Rabba, Caroline. The real issue here is, does the Torah stay valid forever? Classic example, Christianity, okay? The New Testament goes to great pains to show how Jesus is greater than Moses. Why? Why does it do that? Because only if Jesus is greater than Moses, right, can you have a new covenant. All right? To give you an example that I think all of you remember, in the Passover Haggadah, there's a debate that a lot of people don't understand, but it's actually something very simple. The debate is about whether you have to remember the Exodus from Egypt every day, or also every day and every night. right? Remember that debate that occurs in the Haggadah, and a lot of people read it and don't really get what it's talking about. What is it really talking about, and why is it included in the Haggadah? If you read a little more closely inside that debate, the real debate going on in there is Lehavi Limot HaMashiach. The exodus from Egypt was the hand of God in history, the hand of the Savior for the people of Israel. Will that be the greatest redemption ever? Or will there be a redemption that is even greater? When the Messiah comes. In other words, and that's of course the way the Chazal think, that gets turned into a technical halachic question. Okay, we have to remember the exodus from Egypt every day. How come? Because that was the great redemption of the children of Israel. But when the Messiah comes, and the great redemption comes, will the exodus from Egypt be overshadowed? Maybe there will no longer be a reason to remember the exodus from Egypt, and instead we'll praise the Messianic redemption, because that's even greater. So what the Haggadah is saying is that even in Messianic times, the redemption from Egypt will not be overshadowed. Okay, so let's use that as a parallel to what's going on here with Moses and the Messiah. When the Messiah comes, will everybody forget about Moses? Arguably, in Christianity, that's exactly what happened. Okay, Jesus,
Islam,
totally, right? But Jesus overshadows Moses. And when you overshadow Moses, you are casting doubt upon the eternal relevance of the commandments that Moses brought, right? So this is part of Maimonides' polemic against Islam, which he wrote about in the beginning of this epistle, which we didn't read, right? That no Muhammad, no madman is going to overshadow Moses himself and accuse the Jews of falsifying the Torah. That's what he talks about in the beginning of the epistle. And now he's coming back to it here. He's saying it's not just any madman like Muhammad won't overshadow Moses. There is no Messiah, no Jewish Messiah who will overshadow Moses. The Messiah would defer to Moses? He would proclaim, the Messiah, if the Messiah comes and proclaim, if the Messiah comes and proclaims Moses to always have been the greatest, then you're saying this danger wouldn't exist. Okay, that's exactly what Maimonides expects the Messiah to do. Maimonides expects the Messiah to enforce the Torah of Moses and to change nothing in the world, in the nature, in other words, and nothing in the Torah. And that's what he expects. But Maimonides is only one side of an internal tension within the Jewish tradition. Because in the Jewish tradition, you also have anti-Maimonidean elements, opposite elements, who will say that when the Messiah comes, things must change. How could they remain the same? You know, I'll put this to you now, even though we're doing Maimonides tonight, as a little bit of preparation for the coming classes. And well, of course, we'll go over this again, but just begin to think about it. Begin to think about it. Why do you need a Torah? Why do you need, say, the 10 Commandments? In a perfect world, would you need the 10 Commandments? We're not a perfect world, someone here is saying, Jenny is saying. We're not a perfect world, so we need the 10 commandments. But what's the Messiah going to bring?
Peace. But
Okay,
not-
so Elisheva says peace. Jenny says bring the Jews back to Israel. But what if the Messiah is going to bring a perfect world?
That would require Messiah to recreate humankind who are anything but perfect. And I don't think Messiah has that job.
You don't think that's his job, Elisheva? You're
That's-
agreeing with our good friend Maimonides.
Indeed.
Okay, but there is a strain in the Jewish tradition that sees the Messiah as bringing a perfect world. He will change human nature. He may change nature altogether. And if he brings a perfect world, then what need is there any longer for the Torah? Okay,
But-
it's a little bit reminiscent of Jesus's kingdom of heaven. When the kingdom of heaven comes, and when salvation comes for the sins of humanity, then what do you need this old-fashioned Torah for anymore?
But that doesn't just change the rules that tell us how to behave that we don't obey terribly well. It also changes the very nature of creation.
Yeah,
We are created with free will. If we are to become perfect, free will has to be taken away because we're not liable in that. And
great
feels-
questions that I'm not going to answer. Hold your horses for the coming classes. What you're beginning to see, what you're beginning to taste, and we'll go over this again in the coming weeks, okay? You're beginning to taste the opposite of Maimonides, okay? Now let's go back to Maimonides and you'll appreciate Maimonides a little bit more, okay?
no, I'm saying I'm on Maimonides' side. I'm against.
I know you're on Maimonides' side.
Perfect.
Yeah, I know, but you'll appreciate him more by understanding who he's up against.
Okay.
Okay, and so you have this Messiah in Yemen, and apparently this Messiah is doing miracles, and apparently this Messiah is not always so supportive of keeping all the laws of the Torah. Well, if you take Maimonides' stance, then that obviously means that this Messiah ain't no Messiah, and that's obviously what he's going to say. But
Yes.
if you have a different view, that might not be the case. Okay? Now let's go on in the text, now that we have all of this. Okay, you read, do you not know my brother, that the Messiah is a very eminent prophet, more illustrious than all the prophets after Moses, but not Moses. Okay, did everybody here know that the Messiah is a prophet? Maimonides says so here, but is it necessarily so? Go on.
Do you not know that a false pretender to prophecy is liable to capital punishment for having arrogated to himself unwarranted distinction, just as the person who prophesies in the name of idols is put to death, as we read in Scripture? But the prophet that shall speak a word presumptuously in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or that shall speak in the name of other gods, that same prophet shall die. What better evidence is there of his mendacity than his very pretensions to be the Messiah?
In other words, if someone who's not a prophet claims to be the Messiah, his very persona is contradicting his claim. Okay?
So what Maimonides actually says that if somebody claims he's the Messiah, he cannot possibly be the Messiah.
Especially if he's not a prophet.
Yeah. Or if he makes claims that a prophet wouldn't make, a true prophet wouldn't make.
Correct.
How odd is your remark about this man, that he is renowned for his meekness and a little wisdom, as if these were indeed the attributes of the Messiah. Do these characteristics make him a Messiah? You were beguiled by him because you have not considered the preeminence of the Messiah, the manner and place of his appearance, and the marks whereby he is to be identified. The Messiah indeed ranks after Moses in eminence and distinction, and God has bestowed some gifts upon him, which he did not bestow on Moses, as may be gathered from the following verses. His delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, and righteousness shall be the girdle of his loins. 6 appellations were divinely conferred upon him, as the following passage indicates. For a child is born unto us, and a son is given unto us, and the government is upon his shoulder, and he is called Pele, Yoetz, El, Gibor, Abiad, Sar Shalom.
If any of you know Christian polemics, this is
I
a
can
verse.
sing that.
This is a verse that Christians love to quote, but Maimonides is not interested in that. Okay, another
I
verse.
can sing that verse from the Handel's Messiah.
It's Handel's Messiah.
Yeah.
Ah, okay. The big issue is a child is born unto us, a son
Yep.
is given unto us. It's one of the famous quotes by Christian missionaries.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful part of Handel's Messiah.
So that,
And another verse alluding to the Messiah culminates in the following manner. Thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee.
that's another favorite verse of
They
missionaries.
do that a lot. All these statements demonstrate the preeminence of the Messiah.
Okay,
Transcendent wisdom is a sine qua non for inspiration. It is an article of our faith that the gift of prophecy is vouchsafed only to the wise, the strong, and the rich. Strong is defined as the ability to control one's passions. Rich signifies wealthy in knowledge. Now, if we dare not put trust in a man's pretensions to prophecy, if he does not excel in wisdom, how much less must we take seriously the claims of an ignoramus to be the Messiah? That
he's really making fun of him.
that the man in question is a sciolist,
Okay,
that's a word I don't know, is evident
Is it
from the
because-
order he issued, as you state, to the people to give away all their possessions for
Elimos.
Eliam,
I read, again, I told you in the beginning, I read this in Hebrew and I didn't read the translation thoroughly. I saw that it was a good translation and I said, okay, good enough. But what it's talking about here is tzedakah. What the Messiah in Yemen told them to do from the Hebrew translation is for all the Jews in Yemen to give away all of their possessions to the poor. Okay?
Someone who pretends.
What?
Sciolist is someone who pretends to be.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. They did right in disobeying him, and he was wrong inasmuch as he disregarded the Jewish law concerning almsgiving. For scripture says, if a man will devote anything of all that he has, and the rabbis explain in their comment on this verse, part of all that he has, but not all that he has. The sages accordingly set bounds to the bounty of the beneficent in an explicit statement which reads, he who is inclined to be liberal with the poor, need to raise the text, may not part with more than a fifth of his possessions. There is no doubt that the process of reasoning which led him to claim that he is the Messiah induced him to issue a command to his fellow men to give away their property and distribute it to the poor.
In other words, the messianic claim is insane, and also what this Messiah tells people to do is insane.
But it also is reminiscent of things that at least Jesus' followers say that Jesus said, give everything away.
Yeah, there is a resemblance.
And yeah, I mean, is there a direct connection? Is he drawing on that, or is it independent? Or don't we know?
I tend to doubt it, but I don't know.
Induced him to issue a command to his fellow men to give away their property and distribute it to the poor. But then the affluent would become destitute and vice versa. According to this ordinance, it would be necessary for the nouveau riche to return their recently acquired property to the newly impoverished. Such a regulation, which would keep property moving in a circle, is the acme of folly.
Okay, so in other words, this Messiah isn't wise. He can't be a prophet. He's an idiot.
As to the place where the Messiah will make his first appearance, Scripture intimates that he will first present himself only in the land of Israel, as we read. He will suddenly appear in his temple. As for the advent of the Messiah, nothing at all will be known about it before it occurs. The Messiah is not a person concerning whom it may be predicted that he will be the son of so-and-so or the family of so-and-so. On the contrary, he will be unknown before his coming, but he will prove by means of miracles and wonders that he is the true Messiah. Scripture, in allusion to his mysterious lineage, says, "His name is the shoot, and he will shoot up out of this place." Similarly, Isaiah, referring to the arrival of the Messiah, implies that neither his father nor mother, nor his kith nor kin will be known. For he will shoot up right forth as a sapling, and as a root out of the dry ground. After his manifestation in Palestine, Israel will be gathered in Jerusalem and the other cities of Palestine.
I'll raise it. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah?
Yes.
I didn't think that performing miracles was a particularly large part of being a Messiah. I mean, one of the things Christians always say, well, Jesus is the Messiah, look at all the miracles. And usually the reaction is, well, so what?
This is Caroline.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Caroline, your question is even better than you think it is. It's not
How
just
do you
that you're
know
not-
how good I think it is?
because your question is not just that you didn't think that was part of the Jewish idea of the Messiah. It's Maimonides' idea of the Messiah. Maimonides is the one who says that the Messiah doesn't have to perform miracles. And here he's saying he'll be known through his miracles. Right? It's an inner contradiction within Maimonides himself, seemingly at least. What he's trying to do in context is to show that this guy can't possibly be a Messiah. Okay.
Okay, then will the tidings spread to the east and the west until it reach you in Yemen and those beyond you in India, as we learned from Isaiah, that sendeth ambassadors by the sea, even in vessels of papyrus upon the waters. Go, ye swift messengers, to a nation that has been pulled and plucked, to a people that suffered terribly from their beginning onward. The process of the final redemption will not be reversed, so that it will first appear in distant lands and ultimately reach
In
Palestine.
other words, it cannot start in Yemen and then reach the land of Israel. It's the opposite.
That's
So
the start in Israel.
your Messiah started in the wrong place.
What the great powers are, which all the prophets from Moses to Malachi ascribe to the Messiah, may be inferred from various statements in the 24 books of Scripture. The most significant of them all is the fact that the mere report of his advent will strike terror into the hearts of all the kings of the earth, and their kingdoms will fall. Neither will they be able to war or revolt against him. They will neither defame nor calumniate him, for the miracles he will perform will frighten them into complete silence. Isaiah refers to the submission of the kings to the Messiah in verse. Kings shall shut their mouth because of him. He will slay whom he will. None will escape or be saved, as it is written. And he shall smite the land with the rod of his mouth. That's a very interesting allusion.
It's not just interesting, we talked about it already
If he
a few
will
times.
strike, if he will, what does it say? He will smite the
Smite
land.
the land with the rod of his mouth.
How did God create the world? With a
Yeah,
word.
with speech. So you're saying it's godly.
So is he saying that Messiah is going to share these characteristics with God? That he
Well,
can be
we saw in previous weeks that this verse was used, okay, in ancient times. That
Yes.
according to the Babylonian Talmud, we saw that the rabbis test the Messiah Bar Kokhba for this sort of
Yes.
thing, not exactly this thing.
I also think it's interesting that there are at least 2 or 3 different Isaiahs who are in these. One of them goes between 1 and 2 changes at verse 40. He's quoting verse 11 and verse 52. These are 2 different people? No?
The scholars said talk about first Isaiah and second Isaiah.
Yeah.
This would be second Isaiah. But
52 would be second, but 11 would be.
I don't think this is relevant to the Maimonides or the Jews of Yemen,
Okay.
which, you know, who
They just take it as one.
yeah.
Revolution and war in the entire world, from east to west, will not cease at the beginning of the Messianic era, but only after the wars of Gog and Magog, that was indicated by Ezekiel. I do not believe that this man who has appeared among you possesses these powers.
In other words, this Jewish Messiah in Yemen, do all the kings of the earth tremble, and he smites them with the word of his mouth. We saw the smites in the word of the mouth when we did that apocryphal book. Okay, it was third Ezra, something like that, right? Or fourth Ezra. And this was an expectation for the kind of person the Messiah would be in ancient times. And now the Christians.
You know that the Christians falsely ascribe marvelous powers to Jesus the Nazarene. May his bones be ground to dust.
Worse than the madman, huh?
Such as the resurrection of the dead and other miracles. Even if we would grant them for the sake of argument, we should not be convinced by their reasoning that Jesus is the Messiah. For we can bring 1,000 proofs or so from the scripture that this is not so, even from their point of view. Indeed, will anyone arrogate this rank to himself unless he wishes to make himself a laughingstock?
You, dear reader of this epistle, you don't want to be a laughingstock.
I love this. May his bones be ground to dust. I've been reading a whole lot of Islamic stuff, and tomorrow is Muhammad's birthday. And every time you read, it's peace, blessings be upon him, in commas after his name. And reading this was just hysterically funny. Sorry.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I have 2 questions, actually. Who translated this? I mean, it's using some powerful contemporary English metaphors here.
It's
Yeah,
Boaz.
it's Boaz Cohen, a leader of the conservative movement. And a very fine scholar.
Yes, indeed. Okay, in sum.
I think Richard is asking something, but he's muted.
Oh,
Richard, unmute yourself.
Oh, you know, I'm laughing at some of this because the language is so reminiscent of contemporary political discourse today.
well, he's reasonably contemporary. I mean, he's not
Yeah.
writing this today exactly, but he's not 200 years ago either.
Yeah. You know, it's just, You know, the use of metaphor here is
But realize that Muhammad the madman and Jesus may his bones be ground to dust. That isn't the translator Boaz Cohen. That's the original.
it's a literal translation.
That's what it says.
It sounds like the kind of words that a certain individual who occupies the White House frequently uses.
I
Comparing
always
his rhetoric
think
to Maimonides.
I always think
Alright.
it's a little unfair to Jesus because frankly, I don't believe for 1 second that he would recognize the image of himself. And my mother always used to say, if Jesus knew what had been done to his people in his name over the centuries, he'd be rolling in his grave.
Mm,
Indeed. Assuming that he's in his grave.
Assuming that
Maybe
he-
that's why Maimonides
That was
says this.
kind of my mother's point.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so he's castigated Jesus, he's castigated Muhammad.
He's
And
also castigating this Messiah and whoever believes
particular
it.
Messiah, yeah.
In
Okay.
sum, had this man acted presumptuously or disdainfully, I would deem him worthy of death. The truth seems to be that he became melancholy and lost his mind. In my opinion, it is most advisable, both for your good and for his, that you put him in iron chains for a while until Gentiles learn that he is demented. After you have blazoned and bruited abroad the intelligence concerning this man among them, you may release him without endangering his safety. If the Gentiles gain knowledge about him after he has been locked up by you, they will taunt him and pronounce him irrational, and you will remain unmolested by them. If you procrastinate until they learn of this affair of their own accord, then you will most likely incur their wrath.
Just to understand this, think about the context, okay? You have a rebel Muslim leader in Yemen who's trying to force the Jews to convert against their will. At the same time, during all the suppression, you have this Jew who says, I'm the Messiah and all of these troubles, I'm here to redeem you from them. Right? If he were to go out, this guy is Jewish. If he were to go out and say, I'm the king of the Jews and God is going to punish all of you Muslims and Messiah is here and all of that, right? They would anger them, right? And the Jews might suffer even worse because of it. So he's telling them, lock him up. And then when you release them, they'll know this is the one that all the Jews consider Meshuggah.
And
Yeah.
it makes a great deal of sense. I mean, most of the people who have claimed or been claimed by their followers to be a Messiah have do come up at times of oppression and bad times because people need to feel that they can be rescued.
Yeah.
Remember, my co-religionists, that on account of the vast number of our sins, God has hurled us in the midst of this people, the Arabs, who have persecuted us severely and passed baneful and discriminatory legislation against us, as Scripture has forewarned us. Our enemies themselves shall judge us. Never did a nation molest, degrade, debase, and hate us as much as they.
Okay. You can say that this is rhetoric, that he's saying that Arab persecution or Muslim persecution is the worst persecution in all of Jewish history. On the other hand, he repeats this in more than one place, and it's quite likely that he really saw it that way. Right?
It was the one he was confronting.
Let her be.
Okay. Okay, go on.
Where did I leave off? Never did a nation. Therefore, when David of blessed memory, inspired by the Holy Spirit, envisaged the future tribulations of Israel, he bewailed and lamented their lot only in the kingdom of Ishmael and prayed in their behalf for their deliverance, as is implied in the verse. Woe is me that I sojourn with Meshech, that I dwell beside the tents of Kedar.
The tents of Kedar are taken in medieval times to refer to Arabs.
Mhm.
Okay.
Note the distinction between Kedar and the children of Ishmael. For the madman and imbecile is of the lineage of the children of Kedar, as they readily admit. Daniel alludes only to our humiliation and degradation, like the dust in threshing, suffered at the hands of the Arabs. May they speedily be vanquished. When he says, and some of the host and of the stars it cast down to the ground and trampled upon them. Although we were dishonored by them beyond human endurance and had to put with their fabrications, yet we behaved like him who is depicted by the inspired writer. But I am as a deaf man. I hear not. Text up. I hear not, and I am as a dumb man that openeth not his mouth.
In other words, the fate of the Jews in Muslim lands is to be silent, to hear this, to hear these lies and not respond.
Similarly, our sages instructed us to bear the prevarications and preposterousness of Ishmael in silence. They found a cryptic allusion for this attitude in the names of his sons, Mishma, Duma, and Massa, which was interpreted to mean, listen, be silent, and endure. We have acquiesced, both old and young, to inure ourselves to humiliation, as Isaiah instructed us. I gave my back to the smiters, and my cheeks to them that plucked off the hair. All this notwithstanding, we do not escape this continued maltreatment which well nigh crushes us. No matter how much we suffer and elect to remain at peace with them, they stir up strife and sedition, as David predicted. I am all peace, but when I speak, they are for war. If therefore we start trouble and claim power from them absurdly and preposterously, we certainly give ourselves up to destruction.
In other words, this Messiah is dangerous. Okay.
I shall now narrate to you succinctly several episodes subsequent to the rise of the Arabic kingdom from which you will derive some benefit. One of these refers to the exodus of a multitude of Jews, numbering hundreds of thousands, from the east beyond Ispahan, led by an individual who pretended to be the Messiah. They were accoutred with military equipment and drawn swords and slew all those that encountered them. They reached, according to the information I received, the vicinity of Baghdad. This happened in the beginning of the reign of the Umayyads. The king then said to all the Jews of his kingdom, let your scholars go out to meet this multitude and ascertain whether their pretension is true and unmistakably your expected one. If so, we shall conclude peace with you under any conditions you may prefer. But if it is dissimulation, then I shall wage war against them. When the sages met these Jews, the latter declared, we belong to the children of the district beyond the river. Then they asked them, who instigated you to make this uprising? Whereupon they replied, this man here, one of the descendants of David, whom we know to be pious and virtuous. This man, whom we knew to be a leper at night, arose the following morning healthy and sound.
A miracle.
They believed that leprosy was one of the characteristics of the Messiah, for which they found an allusion to the verse, stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted, that is, by leprosy. Whereupon the sages explained to them that this interpretation was incorrect, and that he lacked even one of the characteristics of the Messiah, let alone all of them. Isn't there something somewhere, I never know the sources of these things, where somebody comes to somebody and says, how will I recognize the Messiah? And he says, go to the gates where the lepers sit. All of the lepers will take all of their bandages off at once and change them.
It's a,
But one
Elisheva, it's a midrash.
at
Yeah,
a time is the Messiah.
it's
What
a
did you-
midrash.
Ah,
Okay. He's, I think we're going to have to stop that because of the time, I think. But he's trying to describe how not to let a messianic pretender become a danger to the Jews of the place. That's what he's going to learn from this story. And, if you remain, I'll read this quickly, if you remain in this land, you will not only perish, but also undermine the teachings of Moses by misleading people to believe that the Messiah has appeared and been vanquished, whereas you have neither a prophet in your midst nor an omen betokening his oncoming, and etc. We're close to the end of the epistle. There's a bit more. Everyone's invited to read it. Maybe we'll even touch upon a bit of it next week. In the coming weeks, what we're going to do is we're going to first describe Kabbalah with an eye towards ideas that can lead to messianic expectations. And then we're going to deal with some of the earliest Kabbalistic messiahs. The main one, his name is Avraham Abulafia. Possibly you even heard of him. And then we're going to go on to the greatest of the Kabbalistic messiahs, who was Shabbatai Tzvi. Okay, so to conclude for this evening, we read the main part of the epistle that deals with what, Messianism in general and this Messiah in Yemen specifically, and this Messiah in Yemen, if you want to give him a bit of credit, he left us with a treasure. We wouldn't have Maimonides' epistle to Yemen if it hadn't been for him. And it's possible that even the Jews of Yemen themselves, the community itself, this Messiah caused them trouble, but it may have been this epistle that eventually drew them to Maimonides and made them become his students from abroad. And with his leadership, this became one of the most unique and beautiful communities in the Jewish diaspora. So have a good week, everybody.
thank you. Can you send us a link to this text?
Don will do so, I believe.
Okay, email it if you can.
Yeah. I'm gonna start
Thank you.
recording. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye, see you next week.
Bye-bye.
להתראות, תודה רבה.
להתראות.
Thank you, Avi.